Welcome to Face to Face. My name is Richard Atwell, and our guest in the studio today is Sewage Councillor and CRD Director Vic Derman. Our topic today is sewage treatment. Vic, why don't you start by telling us a little about yourself? How long have you been a Sewage Councillor and CRD Director?
Well, first of all, Richard, it's a pleasure to be here. I've been a Sewage Councillor now. I'm in my 11th year as a Sewage Councillor and my 8th year as a CRD Director. In Sewage, we have a straw poll to elect directors. 5 of the 8 councillors, or well, actually 4, and the mayor get to be CRD directors. And my second term, I became a director.
So the CRD is full of municipalities. How many other municipalities are electing their directors?
Well, really the only other one is the City of Victoria, and there's pretty good reason for that. You get a director per 25,000 population or portion thereof. So if you have 25,001, you get 2 directors. For a long time, Sewage and Victoria were the only jurisdictions that were large enough to actually have more than one director. So there was a rationale. Most of the other places send their mayor because they only have one director.
So how many directors are we up to at the CRD now?
We are up to 25. And of course, as the region grows, if we keep the proportion the same, it will get larger and larger. We may have to change the numbers as to how many it qualifies to get a second director.
So based on its population, Sewage is the largest municipality. It's got a number of directors. Victoria, second biggest, it's got a number.
Yeah, we have 5 directors because we are a population getting close to between 110 and 115,000. Victoria's about 80,000, so they get 4 directors.
So how does the CRD balance its voting structure at the CRD?
Well, on many items, each director gets 1 vote. And if it's not considered to be a monetary item or certain other things, that's the way it is. When you get into certain issues such as monetary items and some other things, directing a service and so forth, then it's what's called a weighted vote. And that tries to proportion the amount of votes a director vote counts for with the population he represents. You see, I represent, on average, about 23,000 people in Sewage, or close to it. A smaller place that only had, say, a total population of 2,000 would still have 1 director. So that director would be representing far less people. So in a weighted vote, essentially you get a number of votes assigned to you depending upon essentially the population you represent.
Do they ever vote in a non-weighted fashion?
Oh yeah, most votes are unweighted, actually. So most day-to-day business at the board level and so forth are unweighted votes. If it's a major expenditure or something of that nature, then it becomes a weighted vote.
So my understanding is based on the number of residents there are in the municipalities, they're going to be having
to a degree, but it's really based on how many voters you actually represent. You see, there are close to 115,000 people in Sewage, and there's 5 directors. So if you divide 5 into 115,000, you come out with 23,000. So each Sewage director is essentially representing 23,000 people. Machosen has a population just around 5,000. So the Machosen director, they only have 1, but he's only representing 5,000 people.
Okay.
So if you try to balance it off, and you say, well, we might give each Sewage director in a weighted vote 5 votes, and the Machosen director would only get 1. So that's how it goes. Most times it's not weighted.
Okay, so let's get into the sewage committee.
Sure.
Okay. So the sewage project coming down the road, it's been barreling down the road for a long time. Mm-hmm. And it's not a sewage project for the whole region.
No, it isn't. It is for what's called the core area. And that involves essentially 7 municipalities. Oak Bay, Sewage, Victoria, Esquimalt, View Royal, Colwood, and Langford. And they are right now on a common sewer system that feeds into the major CRD trunk lines. And those trunk lines reach 2 outfalls, one at Clover Point and one at Macaulay Point. And the sewage, which has been screened, kind of a bit of a primary treatment and takes out anything that's particularly large, about a 6 millimeter screen, then it goes out through the outfalls, which go out close to 1.5 kilometers offshore and land in pretty deep, cold and rapidly flowing water.
So what are they doing in North Sewage, Central Sewage, and Sydney?
Well, they are, of course, in a much different situation because they have a sewer treatment plant, But of course, essentially their effluent that comes out, or would be the equivalent of what goes in our outfalls, it goes into waters that are much different. They're receiving waters. They're not as deep, as cold, and as fast moving. So you really don't want to put in effluent there that hasn't been treated. So they treat, primarily to a secondary level, I believe.
So we've got a higher level of treatment at that plant for that neighborhood, and then we're trying to get our system up to a higher standard.
Yeah, we've been mandated to meet coming federal regulations, which require you to go to a level of secondary treatment. Secondary treatment primarily deals with two things. It deals with what is called biological oxygen demand, or BOD. That takes place, essentially, it's the organic material in it, how much oxygen is required to break it down. And of course, if you're using too much oxygen in an environment, then you destroy the viability of the environment for a lot of organisms that really depend on oxygen. We don't really do that at the present time. And the other thing secondary treatment deals with, to a certain degree, to a fair degree, is what's called total suspended solids. And that's the solid material simply in the sewage stream, which is mostly liquid, close to 99% liquid actually. But there are the solids, and secondary treatment deals with those.
Other cities run secondary treatment. Is there anything beyond secondary treatment?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, secondary treatment doesn't deal very well with a lot of what people have concern with heavy metals and with emerging chemicals. Some of the pharmaceuticals and so forth, the personal care products that sometimes we don't really know what the effect will be.
This is everything that goes down the drain.
Yeah, exactly. And you wish people wouldn't put it down the drain. In some cases, even if they're careful, it's going down the drain because it may be on their bodies and, whatever. They may be taking a certain antibiotic or certain other medicines, and they excrete it when they go to the bathroom. So secondary treatment doesn't deal with those things very well. There's a higher level of treatment called tertiary treatment, which results in a much cleaner effluent, close to drinkable, actually, although most people would be probably a little bit squeamish to drink it. But it's considerably higher quality than secondary, and it actually does deal with the emerging chemicals much better.
So it sounds like it's cleaned up the water a lot more. It's removed the solids you talked about earlier. What can you then do with the water? Is it drinking quality? Is it close to drinking quality?
Well, it's close. And of course, if you want to spend enough money and the equipment, you can have drinking water. In places where water is scarce, such as Singapore, they actually treat their sewage to a drinking water quality. And for what we would see typically out of tertiary, it would be safe to use for washing clothes, for flushing toilets, for taking showers, for agriculture, for industrial purposes, all sorts of things of that nature.
So that seems like a big jump to me. You've gone from secondary treatment where it's not dealing with these chemicals to a tertiary level where it's making the water, putting it into a form where it can re-enter the environment in a safe fashion.
Well, secondary deals with some of the chemicals. There are various estimates. Some people will say it will take out 80% of 50% of the chemicals, so that that you'll deal with about half of them, not quite fully. Tertiary, in some estimates, are as high as 90 to 94% of those chemicals being dealt with. In terms of the metals that you're concerned with, they're really best dealt with through the heavy metals through a source control program, which we have a really, really good one at the CRD. It has removed chemicals from over about a 10-year span as much as 95% and 98% by simply putting in things like grease traps and putting in traps in dentist's office to make sure that amalgams and other things dentists use don't get into the stream and those kinds of things.
So the ability of the system to take out the chemicals sounds like it depends on the property of those chemicals. All metals have different properties. The chemicals bind to different things.
Yeah, it does. And of course, with some of the heavy metals, we know that we don't want them there. You don't want a lot of lead, for example, in anything that you're putting out into any kind of receiving environment. With some of the emerging chemicals, we're not sure what are the consequences of them. We don't know what are the effects of very, very dilute concentrations over a period of time at the present time. Obviously, if you have them in heavy enough concentrations, you're going to do damage, as you would with a lot of other things. But there is beginning to be a caution developing saying, oh, maybe we should be trying to take care of these emerging chemicals because they could be a problem. You know, at one time people thought it was fine to use DDT.
Right.
Didn't turn out to be so fine after all. We don't know that with the emerging chemicals. We know they're in very small concentrations right now, but there is some concern that maybe we should start to move on a precautionary basis to make sure we take them out.
Okay, so on a precautionary note, and I've looked at the CRD's plan, and they would like to put a plant at McLaughlin Point, which is the entrance of the harbor, and there's another marine outfall they want to build, and some percentage of chemicals are going to be captured and some are going to continue to go out. What's the fate of the chemicals that are going to be captured?
Well, some of them in the process of treatment, and also because there is a certain temperature with the treatment and so forth, it's a biological process. And then the fact that you develop what are called biosolids, because when you do secondary treatment, one of the things you do is take those suspended solids we were talking about and you let them settle and you collect them and they become the residue. The rest is treated and goes out into the ocean as effluent, treated to a secondary level. The biosolids, you have to figure out what you're going to do with them. They have a fair number of the chemicals remaining in them, not all. Some of them have stayed in the effluent, gone out to the ocean. Some of them have been removed in treatment, a minority in that respect. So the biosolids, you have to take a look and say, okay, how are we going to handle those? Currently, the plan is, at least the default at the current time, is that they would be piped through a 17-kilometer pipeline to Heartland landfill. And at Heartland, they would be dealt with what are called biodigesters, which are like a very big composter in many ways. That destroys some of those chemicals, some of them remain. Because biodigesters only deal with really about 40 to 50% of that material, and they gasify it. And you can collect the gas and you can use it as a resource to power an engine, to make electricity. If you upgrade it to a certain level, you can use it in fuels in a vehicle. But you have the 50 to 60% left. What are you going to do with it? And that's a problem for the CRD right now. They don't really know what they're going to do with that residue material.
This is Face to Face, and we're talking with Saanich Councillor and CRD Director Vic Derman. So earlier you mentioned the pipelines getting the material from one site to the other. There was the McLaughlin Point, there's a treatment plant, and then I think you called it a digester up at Heartland Landfill. Why are pipes the selected technology or the means of transportation? Why isn't this material being trucked there or being sent there by barge or sent elsewhere? Well,
of course, the issue became, what are you going to do with this residue material? First of all, the site that they have chosen for the central sewage plant at McLaughlin Point simply is not large enough to accommodate both the treatment that you do for the whole stream and treat the liquid and to have a biosolids facility. So they needed to, and ideally what you would do would be to have, if you were going to go with that method of dealing with sewage, you'd have one plant or one site that was big enough to include both the treatment of the sewage liquid and also to have biosolids treatment on it.
So that would be an ideal scenario.
That would be ideal if you're going to go with that kind of central plant approach.
Is that what they're doing in other cities?
Well, they have done, but we talk about that maybe in a minute. But McLaughlin Point, the site that they selected, isn't big enough. It's barely big enough to get the sewage treatment plant on, if they get it there. So then you had to find another site for the biosolids. And they picked biodigesters as a technology. They call it a representative technology at this point, but it requires a site of some 4 to 5 acres or about 2 hectares for people who are metric. It's not easy to find those kind of sites in an urban area. So really, most of the available sites that were available were further away. And the obvious easiest one is Heartland Road landfill, because it's already owned by the public. There aren't a lot of houses around it and so forth. There was lots of concerns in Esquimalt about the location of the sewage facility in Esquimalt and what it might mean to Esquimalt for traffic and noise and all sorts of things. And so very early on in the process, or fairly early on in the process, the committee made a promise to Esquimalt that you would not truck the biosolids through, that instead you would pipe them. So that is that they made that solemn commitment, and that means that you have to create a 17-kilometer pipeline to take it out to Heartland, and then after you have treated it, there will be some effluent that has to come back to the sewage treatment plant to go through to go out in the ocean.
So I understand that the CRD has looked at other sites, some of them that you can't talk about because they've been done in an in-camera process in order to protect landowners and the sanctity of the deal and so forth.
Yeah.
But I've heard that early on the CRD made a decision not to use ALR land and not to expropriate land. Because some of this land is available. It's closer than Heartland.
Yeah, and sometimes it's an issue of closeness, and sometimes it's an issue of how close it is to existing pipes and things of that nature. Obviously, I can't talk about things where in camera, and sometimes you're right. You make a deal with the owner of the property and say, we want to negotiate with you, and the owner may say, fine, but I don't want anybody else to know about it, so you sign a non-disclosure agreement. And then you're bound legally to keep your mouth shut, essentially. And sometimes the public gets worried, why didn't you? Well, you've signed that kind of agreement. But certainly there were some that have become very public. One was the site of Viewfield in Esquimalt.
Yeah, that was quite famous.
Yes, it was. And that one was right in, very close. It was in a bit of an industrial park in Esquimalt, not far from Esquimalt High School, actually, but very close also to residences, some of which were within probably 50 to 100 meters of the site. And I guess the site became available, and the CRD decided that it was a possibility because it was a large enough site to accommodate the biosolids facility. And they purchased it for $17 million without having, because of the situation they were in, without being able to go out to the public and talk about the public before. I thought at the time, I think now, that was a very unfortunate decision. I think it's almost you're doomed to failure when you go to the public and say, we've already bought this site, and now we're going to consult with you to see if we should use it.
Right.
That's fraught with difficulty and fraught with risk. Also, the problem was the proximity of residences. We had a CRD's consultant report a number of years earlier that said, don't locate this kind of facility, the biodigesters, within 300 meters of any residences. And the reason is there's some danger. It has a lot of gas in it, and it is potentially an explosive device. And if you look over the last decade or so, I think there have been something like 67 explosions around the world, including 3 fatalities. So we had that. In Alberta, they have a legislation that you cannot locate that kind of facility within 300 meters. So, of course, when the public...
But not here in BC.
No, we don't have a rule, but we had a consultant who said, you really shouldn't locate it within 300 meters. So the public was up in arms already, and when they found out that our own consultant had said no, because if you drew a 300-meter radius around the Viewfield site, there were all sorts of residences inside of it.
Right.
And, of course, those people were alarmed, and they had every right to be so.
So I went to some of these open houses that occurred after the purchase to sell the concept and contrast it to the Heartland site. And a lot of the photos that were shown were photos of other parts of the neighborhood. In fact, the houses were really not shown much at all. There was a hydro substation that was shown and some of the other warehouses in the area. It's a mixed-use area. There's houses, warehouses, and so on. Why do you think the CRD tried to downplay the proximity to the residences?
Well, I hope they didn't. I hope there was no conscious effort to indicate that this was not an area that was fairly residential. I hope that was accidental, that people simply took some pictures and used those. I can't say. I wasn't part of that process. I would be very disappointed if it was. But a big issue on...
Well, I'm just asking you that question because...
I don't know.
Because you talked about this consultant's report that said not to locate near the residences.
Well, we had a change in staff directing the sewer plan between the time that consultant's report was done a number of years back and when the Viewfield purchase took place. It's possible that the new staff directing the thing were somewhat unaware of that report. I don't know. not all the things, as a member of the committee and a director responsible, we don't get all the information about, how publicity things are created, how information is created for public open houses and so forth. We have a policy that we expect staff to follow. Hopefully they do, but we're not there on a day-to-day basis to direct them as to exactly what should be put out and what should be created.
Right. The CRD is a governmental corporation. It's staffed. It has a type of CEO running the thing.
Oh, absolutely.
And then you as a director sit on the board and oversee that.
Yeah, we do. Now, you meet once a month as a board member, usually. Occasionally there are more frequent meetings on demand, but you're certainly not, you're there to set general policy. If the policy is not followed, you're there to ask and question why, but you're not there on a day-to-day basis to say, I want you to take this step,
right,
or I want you to take that step. That's certainly within the power and realm of staff,
right,
who are then should be answerable to the board.
So going back to this Viewfield scenario again, would it be the staff that recommend the selection of the site, and is it the directors that approve?
Yeah. Staff would normally, if a director wishes, he can bring a resolution saying, gee, I think there's a site here, I'd like a staff report on whether or not this is a good site. Mm-hmm. But ultimately it's staff that recommends it, and then they bring a report to the directors, and the directors decide whether or not it should be purchased. In the case of Viewfield, I was not comfortable with that purchase. The majority of directors were. Mm-hmm. One of the issues on the biosolids process is that they have selected the technology that in some applications makes sense, the biodigesters. I'm not sure that it does in our situation in the core area. It takes a lot of space, and it leaves a lot of residue. 50 to 60% of material that you have to decide what to do. And by the way, we're really not sure what we are going to do with that yet. The first go around was we would sell it to cement kilns in Vancouver. We'd dry it, ship it by barge, send it to the Lower Mainland, and they would burn it for fuel in cement kilns. It turns out that they might not want it. So that would put the end to that. What are the other alternatives? Well, you can put it on land. But there's a lot of people who are saying, no, that is passé, because this essentially what you've done is concentrate some of the chemicals in the biosolids. If you put them on land, mm-hmm, some of those chemicals will leach out into the watersheds and end up in creeks and streams and small lakes and ultimately the ocean. When they're in those small watercourses, you could get levels of concentration much higher than you would in the ocean. So there's a concern that that's not the approach. So then what do you do? Do you simply landfill them in Heartland landfill? That's questionable, because our goal is to make Heartland landfill last for a long period of time. And the last thing we want to be doing is find extra materials to put into it to fill it up faster. So the issue of the selection of technology, the biodigesters, it has these problems. There are other technologies such as modern gasifiers. And I say modern because of the recent applications, but they've been around for a long time, well over 100 years. They gasify as much as 80% of the material. So you get more of it turned into gas, which you again can use to power an engine. You can use it if you upgrade it for fuel, such as terracins or gas lines. And it also results in an ash that comes out that is somewhat inert. And you could landfill it, but you could also probably put it into roadbeds or something of that nature, mm-hmm, if you wanted to. So quite possibly a better solution. The nice thing about a modern gasifier is that, having looked at a number of plants that exist around the world, they tend to be put on a site that's an acre in size, or roughly around that size. So about a quarter to a fifth the size of what we need, mm-hmm, closer to a quarter, I guess. You could find a lot more sites, a lot closer, with that kind of technology. And also, it's a lot easier than if you are trying, and there'll be a building on that. Dockside Green has one, by the way, and the building doesn't really look too offensive. It's easier to put a shell around the building, camouflaging it, so that it looks attractive, mm-hmm, and doesn't upset the neighbors, right, and things of that nature. They are, while they do involve gas, they also have a better track record in terms of safety compared to the biodigesters. Mm-hmm. So if we are going to the system we're going to, I have been trying to push that, wow, maybe we should be looking at the modern gasifiers. Then maybe we don't have to chase our tail trying to find these really big sites and, upsetting the public in the process. But we haven't been willing yet to go there, unfortunately.
You're watching Face to Face with Vic Derman, Saanich Councillor and COD Director. So what I'm hearing from you, if I'm understanding this correctly, we've got two competing technologies. CRD has selected one, and there's another one that is a possibility. One of them produces it takes the output from the wastewater plant and it processes it and it reduces it somewhat. Another one reduces it far more. One has a bigger footprint than the other. What about the cost?
Well, it's hard to say. First of all, it reduces it far more may or may not be the right term. Most digesters reduce in the range of 40 to 50%. The modern gasifiers are more in the range of sort of 60 to 65 to 85%. So it's significantly more, I guess it's fair enough to say.
But is the output different?
Well, the output is different in terms of the quality of the gas, but it can be upgraded. They both produce gas, which you can use as a resource, and that's one of the reasons you do it, to try to start to turn sewage into a resource and, take this gas, use it to produce electricity, use it to produce heat, use it as a fuel, whatever you might do. There are steps of upgrading in each case that you can take. You might have to do a little bit more upgrading with the modern gasifier, depending on the use you want to do. If you want to use it for fuel, you probably would. But they're similar in that respect. You get more gas out of the modern gasifier, and then the other thing is the end product. The end product is less of a problem, probably, with modern gasifiers. Now, biodigesters provide an excellent end product if you're putting in clean organic material. Because then what comes out you can use as compost on farms or wherever. Most farms, especially organic farms, can't touch anything that's had sewage sludge in it, and even most farmers are getting less and less comfortable about that kind of application.
Now, what's the difference between sewage sludge and biosolids? Are they
they're the same thing.
Okay, they're just two different terms for the same
sewage
thing.
sludge is what it is. The term, a number of years back, the term biosolids was coined. I guess it has less of an ugly connotation than sewage sludge does.
When I first heard it, I didn't know what it meant, and I think perhaps that's the reason why it was perhaps invented that way.
It almost sounds benign, biosolids, and it is organic material, but it does have a lot of nasty things in it, and a fair amount of those are dealt with either in the initial treatment of all the liquid or the treatment of the solids that come out. But there are still some in the end product, and that's where there is a growing concern, probably, it's fair to say, with putting it on land.
Now, the first time I heard about this term biosolids was about 2 or 3 years ago when the CRD banned what they call the land application of biosolids. Now, there's no sewage system producing them, but a ban was put in place anyways.
Well, there were two things in there. One,
was this in anticipation of the digesters?
In part, it was. In fact, probably mainly. It's fair to say. There was, of course, the sewage treatment plant out in the peninsula that was producing and continues to produce biosolids. And for a while, the CRD was.
And where do those go right now?
Well, now essentially they're landfill, I believe. But there was a time when the CRD was bagging them up and giving them away to people as fertilizer. And that's not new. Other places have done it. Lots of people might have heard of a product called mill organite, which is from the Milwaukee sewage system.
I remember what ours was called because I picked some up at the Heartland.
It was Pengro.
Pengro, yeah.
Pengro, yeah.
It was a little bag of white material, and I was supposed to amend the soil with it, mix it up with my plants or whatever.
And there's lots of good things in it. The question is, over time, is this harmful? And there's a debate about that, to be honest. But there is a growing concern that maybe this isn't the best thing to do. And again, if you're working on the precautionary principle, I'll give you an example. At one point, we had a suggestion that the way we would deal with biosolids is a program called Willow Cospis, We would put it onto land where we would grow willow trees, and then we would cut the willow trees and chip them up and use them as fuel. We needed about close to 2,000 hectares. It's a pretty big area to do that.
That's a number I can't quite imagine. What's something of that size?
That's close to 5,000 or 6,000 acres. That's a pretty big area. You know, your average golf course is probably 100 to 150 acres. So, or around.
So this could be
around 50 hectares.
This could be a willow farm the size of Greater Victoria.
Not quite, but pretty big. Yeah, a good part of the Saanich Peninsula. So it would be out somewhere in the forested lands, presumably. But the suggestion was that you might be able to do that only 15 or 20 years, and then certain chemicals would be at a level, heavy metals in particular, that you wouldn't want to do it anymore. So once you know that, you think, okay, is it really a great idea to be passing that out to the public, to be dumping on their lawn every year or in their vegetable garden or whatever? Certainly one application probably wouldn't be a problem, but the jury's out on whether that's a good practice to do really any longer or not.
Right. So it sounds like we're doing more advanced sewage treatment for a precautionary reason, yet the end product of this plan is something that also should be dealt with in a precautionary fashion.
Well, it may be, yeah. And that's certainly what some, I know Philippe Lucas, who was a director last term, not this term, and
from
Victoria Council, was very much opposed to putting the biosolids onto land. I have concerns about it. I don't know conclusively that it's a problem at this time, but there is more and more evidence suggests it could be. So again, if you can avoid it, I don't think it's a great thing to do.
So it's biological material we're talking about. It's contaminated, if you will, with chemicals and things that we put in our bodies that go down the drain. We're trying to divert it from going into the ocean. We're going to turn it into this biosolids form. And then an option would be to apply it to the land, and then as it gets rained on, it ends up back in the water courses and perhaps even back in the ocean in the first place. Yeah,
well, eventually it would end up in the ocean. Now, in the whole process...
To me, that seems completely illogical.
Yeah, it's a concern I have. You know, some of it, as you go through these processes, is destroyed. Some of it still remains. I have a concern about it going on land, partly, you know, do you create a problem with land where you're growing food crops or something of that nature? But beyond that, if you do put it on land, and you're right, it does leach into a watershed, and it can end up in streams and so forth, where I think I mentioned earlier, the concentrations are far higher because the stream holds a lot less water than the ocean.
Yes.
So you could potentially, and we don't have any definitive studies, we haven't done them, but you could end up with levels that that were problematic. You know, that could cause mutations in fish or something of that nature. You know, we haven't seen that in the ocean.
Would we need 20 years, perhaps, even to notice something like that?
Yeah, it would be probably over a period of time. Although you could run studies with, you know, fish at various concentrations to see what happened. It would take a while to figure out, you know, what kind of concentration you would build up in the natural system by doing it.
So what about the plants and animals? If it's ending up in the land, you know, the animals forage off the forest floor and it takes up into...
Again, to be honest, I'm not a biologist, but there are enough concerns there that if there's another way, such as the gasifiers, that can avoid that, it might be an advantage. We've already mentioned that the gasifiers likely would take a lot less space, and so that you might be able to locate them, you know, closer in and on a smaller piece of property. That has an advantage in terms of the cost of the property. And it's also quite possible that they might be cheaper. The biosolids plant they're planning with biodigesters out at Heartland would cost some $265 million. That's virtually a third of the whole cost of the project. Now, I had some rough figures from a company that suggested modern gasifiers could be much, much less expensive. Now, given their other advantages, I think it's something we should have investigated long before now, and unfortunately we haven't. You know, we've sort of made statements that, well, these are an unproven technology and so forth. I just don't think that's true. They haven't been that commonly used for sewage sludge yet. There are a couple of places where they have, but it's just a fuel. And sewage sludge, if it's dried, has about the same value for heat that wood has. And of course, if you should be concerned about chemicals coming out of the stack, but you can scrub a stack and you can capture all of those. So it's something that we should have looked at, and we haven't. And that's one of my concerns at the present time with the whole sewer treatment project. I don't think we have done our due diligence. We should have been willing to take a look and say, what are all the alternatives available? What are the best ones? We ran what is called a request for expressions of interest at the very start, which is saying, anybody who has ideas about how this might be done, put them forward.
Is this normally how projects are?
It often happens at the start, so that you can get a sense of what's out there.
Is it normal for the CRD to use this process?
In this size project, yes.
You're watching Face to Face with Saanich Councillor and CRD Director Vic Derman, and we're talking sewage treatment.
Sure. Now, talking about a request for expressions of interest, yeah, it's common in a project to do a sounding, to see what's out there in terms of ideas. When we did our original request for expressions of interest in late 2006, and the results coming out early in 2007, when we were first mandated, we unfortunately
What do you mean by first mandated? Maybe
well,
explain that
the
for
province mandated us and said, hey guys, you're going to have to treat your sewage. And that's the reason we started.
Is that all they said?
Well, they said that, but they also said a number of criteria, which perhaps we can mention in a minute. But they did mandate us to, and we also knew that there were federal regulations coming down that essentially, over time, areas were going to have to move to at least secondary level treatment. So basically, we ran the request, but we didn't make it wide open. And we didn't look broadly. We essentially looked and sort of said, what is there out there that could fit onto our existing system of big pipes going to two major locations for outfalls? And that means one or two large plants. And what options do we have doing that? We didn't really look to see if there were other approaches that might work as well or better, that might provide a better environmental outcome and might be cheaper, or either initially cheaper or cheaper over the lifetime or life cycle of the project. As a consequence, it's hard to defend what we've put forward and say we know this is the best. In fact, I suspect that there may be better alternatives out there. One approach is what is called a decentralized system. A decentralized system has a lot of, or at least a number, of smaller plants around the region dealing with treatment. There are technologies that are very suitable to those plants. Dockside Green in Victoria is an example of such a plant. It has a plant right underneath the housing in the facility. Initially, when they started up, they didn't have all the automated controls in place, as I understand, and there were a few issues. But over the last few years, when they have put in all the appropriate controls and so forth, it's worked apparently very well with few issues.
And this is across the water, across the Bay Street Bridge. And as I understand it, there's a bakery right beside it, and there's a coffee shop right beside it.
Yeah, I've sat and had several coffees in that coffee shop, and you hardly even, well, unless you know there's a sewer treatment plant there, you would never know there was one there. It treats to, it's off Tyee Road for people who, between Esquimalt Road and Bay Street. There is a nice little water feature in front of the fairly expensive condominiums. It's reasonably upscale development. And that water feature is all recycled sewer water. So
that's amazing.
Yeah, that's entirely what it is. And one of the reasons they can do that is their system, which happens to use very fine filters to take material out, it treats to what is called a tertiary level. Because they originally get very clean effluent to start with, much cleaner than you would from secondary system. And then because it's so clear, it's easy to treat it for ultraviolet light, which deals with any viruses and other things and some chemicals that would be in the material. So
would that be a similar process to a light I would have in my furnace that's killing germs that's coming through my house?
Somewhat. We use it actually in our water system as one of our barriers of protection.
So it's a disinfectant of a kind?
It is a disinfectant, very much so. So when we treat our water, we put chlorine in. which deals with some of the issues. There are some bacteria and so forth that aren't dealt with in that manner, some parasites. And we have UV treatment, which takes care of that to make sure it's not going to be a problem. So we have a very good, essentially, protection system in our water system. In the sewage treatment, it results in a very high level of effluent that I haven't been on a tour of Dockside for a while, but I understand when the tour guide finishes, he takes a glass of the water and he drinks it. And he has no problem with that because it is really virtually at drinkable level. So you could have a number of these plants around the region. They would have the advantage of, if they were similar, and there are other technologies, they would have the advantage of providing a higher level of treatment. So, I mean, the reason we are supposedly treating is we are trying to get environmental benefit.
Right.
To be honest with you, the ocean right now is doing much of what secondary treatment would do.
And is that why we have lagged behind other cities in adopting secondary treatment?
Yeah, we have what are called deep outfalls. And the water we send it into is very highly oxygenated, very cold water. So we have no biological oxygen demand problem there at all.
What about pathogens?
Well, that's the pathogens are different. That's the emerging chemicals and pathogens and things of that nature. As far as pathogens go, you know, health concerns, Richard Stanwyck, who is the regional health officer, and I think about 6 or 7 other past and present regional health officers signed a letter saying there is no health problem there. You know, they have never known one to occur. Richard Stanwyck made the statement that if he was looking at health concerns around the region, that the sewage outfalls, which are in fairly deep water, well offshore, would be way, way, way down the list. So, you know, there doesn't seem to be an issue there.
So when the minister mandated this movement forward, I think you said it was 2006.
It was.
What was the problem that they were trying to solve? If it wasn't a health problem they were trying to solve.
No, there was a report came out called the McDonald Report, which was a very preliminary report, and the authors of the report themselves said that in the report, that indicated that in terms of the solids that were being collected around the outfalls, and there is some of that, that might qualify, and at least in the case of Macaulay, as a contaminated site under provincial legislation.
And Macaulay is one of the outfalls.
It is one of them. The other one's Clover Point.
Clover Point.
Yeah. And so the minister, and I understand his concern, but I think it was a bit of a knee-jerk reaction where he said, okay, fine, you will treat. To be honest, I think there should have been a lot more follow-up research to see exactly, because the McDonald Report didn't intend to be conclusive, to see exactly what was happening. Nevertheless, when the minister, and we'll get back to what you'd asked earlier, when the minister did mandate us, he set a number of stipulations that included making sure we made maximum use of resources, that we were doing dockside-style innovation.
He actually used the word dockside.
Yes, he did. It was actually included in the letter we got from him twice, as a matter of fact.
So dockside's been up and running for some number of years.
Yeah, and as I said, the first few years in Dockside, there were some issues. It seems to have completely stabilized in that respect now, once they got the control system.
But this perhaps isn't unique to sewage treatment. Anything large and complex that you start up, where you begin, has startup problems.
Yeah, well,
that need to be worked
especially if you, for financial reasons, perhaps are a little bit delayed in putting in full controls and things of that nature, which I understand may have been the situation at Dockside. So the
was Dockside experimental, if I can ask you that?
Not entirely. The system that they're using called MBR, essentially it's a filtration system, had been around for a little while. It's been around longer since. There have been concerns in the past about how much energy it takes to run those systems. They have been getting more and more efficient. I brought to the CRD board a little while back an announcement made by a major company that produces those kinds of technologies, and they had managed to create a system where they reduced by 70% the amount of energy needed to clean the filters, which is the main energy use in that particular system. It resulted in the expectation of a 30% or 30% plus reduction in energy used for the entire system. So they may be getting energy competitive with what we are proposing. The other thing is, of course, you avoid a lot of pumping costs because you're not necessarily pumping this material all around the region to get to two places in the ocean, where you're going to throw it out.
Right.
So the minister wanted us to make sure that if we were going to treat, we maximized the environmental benefit, we maximized the use of sewage as a resource, we got the highest quality effluent, and we were, in that respect, fairly leading edge. Not bleeding edge, which means you're dealing with something that's really experimental and you don't know if it's work, but we were fairly leading edge. That's one of my greatest criticisms of what we're doing.
Now, this was in the 2006 or 7 time period.
Well, yes.
Dockside's been operating since about that time,
yeah,
right?
the minister also reiterated his interest in 2009 when he wrote another letter to the committee.
Were these objectives that he stated, or were these nice-to-haves?
They didn't mandate us entirely to do them. He would have to sign off, and in the end, in 2010, he did, which was a real disappointment to me because I don't think we met any of the things he had indicated he wanted to see us accomplish, other than meeting the basic regulations of secondary treatment, which we probably will do with the exception of overflows. And when we have a serious rain event, which of course you're going to have in the winter in Victoria, we have a lot of what is called infill and infiltration, and that's our pipes are a bit leaky. Sewage doesn't leak out of them, which is good because they have negative pressure and they draw things in, but all sorts of rainwater leaks in. And what happens at that time is we exceed the capacity of our pipes and plant, even the proposed plant, to treat it. So we will be sending untreated effluent out into the ocean during such events, even after we build the plant.
Well, how can we meet the regulatory standard?
First of all,
is that a gray area or a fine line?
Well, it's hard to say. First of all, it is a lot more dilute because you've got more rainwater in it. And it will be screened, as we presently screen our sewage today. I can't tell you how the federal government will interpret that regulation. If they say, okay, we'll let you get away with it because it is only happening 5 or 6 or 10 times a year or 20 times a year or whatever, and it is fairly dilute, then you'll be okay. If they say no, by the regulations, you have to treat all your sewage, then we'll be in some considerable difficulty. And that's not clear yet, which it's going to be. It would be nicer if we had a system that didn't have that question hanging over it, because it is a potentially concerning question. If we build this plant and find out that, hey, we're not really meeting the regulations after all, then you're going to spend a lot of money. Who knows, 100 million more, 150 million more, whatever, to make sure you meet them. But it's not clear.
Wouldn't that be disastrous for the region? As I understand the project and the way the funding is set up, there's funding from provincial government and federal government, but if you go over what the planned cost is, that cost is borne by the taxpayers of the region.
There are all sorts of concern in the region about the issue of cost overruns. Yeah, because we have a project now that's been indicated that will cost $782 million, almost $800 million, I guess, in round figures. The federal government has said they will contribute yay much. The province has said the same. It's sort of a one-third, 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 except it really doesn't quite come out to that because there are some costs that are not eligible for cost sharing, such as the acquisition of land. So it really comes closer to 30% from the federal government, 30% from the province, and 40% from local taxpayers.
From the beginning?
Yeah, in that kind of range. We're probably a little bit under 40, but I don't know, 32, 36 or whatever it might be, or we might, somewhere.
So the Viewfield property, that was paid for by CRD taxpayers?
That would be paid for entirely by CRD taxpayers, absolutely, because land costs are not shareable. So the problem is that if you have a cost overrun, the federal government and the provincial government have capped the amount they will contribute. They said, we'll contribute up one-third, 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 without the eligible costs, of course, up to this maximum amount we're willing to contribute. Now, if we go over in terms of cost, that is entirely borne by CRD taxpayers, or core area taxpayers. the municipalities involved.
And how have the municipalities anticipated how they might budget for that?
Well, you don't know. You know, I mean, basically the
Like, are there any contingency funds set up for this?
No, there aren't. I mean, any project has a certain contingency within it, but it could, if we blew over that contingency, which is a real possibility, then you're really running a risk. See, we have right now a situation where the average taxpayer in the region will probably see by about 2016 an increase in their taxes of somewhere between $300 and $800 a year.
That's quite a range.
It is, but it depends on the size of your property and the value of it and so on and so forth, because a lot of it is based on that. And the municipality you're in and so forth. Some might be in the 200s, some might be close to 1,000.
Is that a fair distribution?
Well, we try to make taxation to some degree, ability to pay. That's why if you have a bigger house, you have a bigger assessment and you pay more. You might not be using a huge amount more of municipal services, but you pay more. That's the way the system goes.
So if my house is bigger and I'm not using a lot of water or I'm not producing a lot of sewage,
your basic property taxes will be higher anyhow. Now, the sewage project, the capital costs would be based on a similar basis to that. The operating costs would be more based on a flat fee for each house, and then how much sewage you produce, which is estimated by the amount of water you use in the wintertime, not in the summertime, when you might be watering your lawn. So if we have an overrun, that could have an inordinate effect on municipal taxes for the local municipalities involved. Because instead of getting 1/3 funding from the province and the federal government, you would have to pay for all of that. If we had a big overrun, 30 or 40%, you could see taxes almost doubling from what the estimates are now. That's problematic. It really is. But back to where we were before. A huge concern I have with this sewage treatment project is we just haven't done our due diligence to allow the best of ideas about decentralized systems and others in the door where they can be presented and evaluated.
What's the harm of doing that?
I don't see any harm. That's why not long ago I brought a motion. I brought a number of motions to CRD over years, one of which came very close to passing back in 2008. And I brought ones since saying, look, let's make sure that we do this so that we can say to the public, we are doing the best thing environmentally that we can. That we can say to the public, we are getting value for money. If you spend $800 million and you're not getting much environmental benefit, we should be doing a study that says, what is the net environmental benefit of this? I mean, if I'm spending $800 million to improve the environment, I would rather like to know how much improvement I'm getting for that money.
I think we all would.
Yeah, gee, I mean, that's a huge amount of money.
No, definitely.
And so I would like to also know that about the current project. For the money spent, what are you getting? What's your value for money? What's the cost-benefit analysis? And then I'd like to have had the situation where I can say, well, let's compare that to a distributed system. How much would it cost? How much environmental benefit would we get from it? Tertiary treatment obviously is a much higher quality effluent. We might have opportunities in the future to reuse water, much more than that. We could probably locate it close to new developments and close to existing heavy users of heat, and we might be able to make use of the heat. We could, there are other advantages. So how much environmental benefit would you get from that kind of system, and how much would it cost? What would the value for money be in that kind of system? That, I think, it should be a fundamental and complete prerequisite. How much flexibility would each system give? We will change in the future. We have a regional growth strategy that says, here's where we like to see future development take place in our region. Okay, fine. Which system fits in best with that? One of the nice things about a distributed system, if it was the choice, is it's very easy to add new capacity. You put in another small plant, or one of the existing plants can easily be expanded. The nice thing about some of the small systems, they're easy to camouflage. We have a pump station in Oak Bay, Curry Road, that has been camouflaged because it was put in a neighborhood. You drive down the street and it looks like one of the nicest houses on the street. Well, nobody lives in it. And if you go inside, you realize it's a sewage pump station.
Right.
But it fits in extremely well.
So instead of working, very hard over the years to try to find a place to get a huge plant away from people, it could just be integrated.
It can be with modern technologies. MBR is one of them. There are others out there. And there are some very exciting emerging technologies that probably will be in place within 10 years. I'm not saying you have to wait. I'm saying if you're going to do it now, and that seems to be the decision, then do the necessary work to make sure you're doing for the public the best you can and getting them the best value for money and getting the best environmental consequence. One environmental measure, for example, is the huge problem, I'm sure you know and others, that we face is climate change. It is a problem that I just shudder at the legacy we may leave to our own kids and certainly their kids. It's a pretty scary world that they're going to face if we don't do something real quick. And that's because of the essentially greenhouse gases that we've been putting in the atmosphere. So it ought to be the number one goal of any big project to say, how can you maximize the greenhouse gas reduction? We haven't done that at all. We have some greenhouse gas reduction, but we're spending, folks, $800 million. With that kind of expense, we should say, what's the best we can do in GHG reduction? Let's get that done. These kinds of questions are critical. And unfortunately, we have been unwilling to answer them. We have simply said, no, this is our project, we're happy with it, so forth, let's go ahead. We need an independent assessment of that. Staff, and I don't blame them, they are committed to the project. They've invested their time and their effort in it. They believe in it. That means they're not well suited to evaluate it because they're believers. We need an independent assessment. We need a new request for expressions of interest where somebody can come forward and say, no, I can do it much better with far better environmental benefit. And I really hope that will happen.
Well, I hope we can get to that, Vic. Thanks for coming in. I've really enjoyed our talk. You've been watching Face to Face with Saanich Councillor and CRD Director Vic Derman, and I'm Richard Atwell, and we'll see you next time.